refuse from masculinity might exist, but that doesn't mean that women have to host the refugee camps.
I'm Jane.
I'm still Tish.
And I'm Bex.
And this is
Insightful Sisters.
So, hello everyone, and welcome to our very first Insightful Sisters. We are beyond excited to have Tish with us tonight. When Bex and I were putting together our wish list of who we wanted on this, she was right there. We wanted you, Tish, because your story inspires, but also because you've done what an awful lot of women have done over the last few years. You found yourself in a difficult circumstance and you've stepped forward and you've used all your different skills, all your amazing skills, and you become like I was thinking today, you're like a sort of one-woman icebreaker heading for something, I'm not sure what. So
Probably iceberg, Jane.
iceberg. So we're really, really thrilled that you're our first, I don't know whether to say victim but anyway. So I'm going to start with a really easy question, something for you. So your background, who are you? I know family is so important. When I've been with you, you've talked a lot about your family, you've talked a lot about your background. What is it about your background, your upbringing, where you're from, that made you ready to do the things that you've done?
Well, I'm one of 8 children, and I'm not that old, I promise you, but because of circumstances, till I was 3 years old, we lived in a 2-roomed house, not 2 bedrooms, 2 rooms.
Wow.
With a toilet at the bottom of the garden, which you had to cross a road to get to. And I slept in an alcove in one of those really old-fashioned big prams, where my dad decided that it would be a good idea to bring a stray dog home. So we had a stray Yorkshire Terrier called Lassie. My mum must have been tearing her hair out. So yeah, I was there for 3 years. Now, my parents are sort of amazing in loads of ways, because while we were living in that house, bearing in mind there were 9 of us, it was before my baby sister was born. My dad worked nights and he built a house during the day. Okay. And they really struggled to get anybody to loan them any money. And this house that we lived on was up a really steep hill, and then a turn and another steep hill. And of course, my mum had all these children, but she was carrying, often pregnant, she was carrying building supplies home up this massive hill. So just absolutely, and I probably didn't appreciate how much and how much they did. But yes, that's the background that I have. So it sounds like something out of the 1930s, but this was I think we moved into the new house 73.
Wow. I'm just working out how you could get 8 and then 9 children in 2 rooms.
Well, I think my mum and the kids were in bunk beds, and I think mum and dad were in double bed. I don't know if they have like a privacy. I mean, it don't bear thinking about, really, does it, considering my mum had 7 babies in 9 years.
Wow.
So it's a wonder.
Yeah.
Very Catholic, very traditional. So, for my mum, there was just no God gave you however many babies you got. And she had her last one, I think, at 48. Wow. And my dad was 50. I think he was about 54, because they didn't meet until he was nearly 40. And she would have been seen as on the shelf at her age, which was about 31 back in the day. And they met and married within 6 months. And of course, they had all these children. I'm number 6, but had they met any younger, I'd be number 26, I'm sure.
What a family to grow up in. So you learnt to stand up for yourself in a big family.
Yeah, you do have to learn to stand up for yourself. But, I was very close to my older brother, the nearest brother to me, and we sort of played out. We climbed trees, jumped off buildings, usual sort of what we'd call tomboy sometimes, but it was never tomboyish for me, because it was normal for working class girls in our neighbourhood, which was Yorkshire. So yeah, I was never dressed up in, I mean, my mum used to put us in, I hated it, but she put us in those days when you went to a party, you'd wear a long dress. But on the not normal run of things, I was just wearing plain out clothes. And I was not an outlier in my neighbourhood. I had plenty of other friends who would go down to the farm and we'd help them move the hay bales, and we'd jump off the buildings. And
Amazing.
So that's, very much that kind of childhood.
What about politics in the household?
Very much left. My granddad, I never met my granddad, but he was a miner. And the story of my dad was that because he was a miner, he was exempt from sort of going into the army, so there was none of that for him. But in the 1926 general strike, my dad was 4, and they couldn't afford to keep him. So they lived in a house at the top of the road, where in fact I was brought up by sheer coincidence. And my dad was given away, as he saw it, to his grandma, his great grandma, and his aunt.
I can see that all of that will have made you a very resilient person.
Yeah, and my dad was a great reader. We would call it the autodidactic tradition, because he had to lose school at 14, even though he was intelligent, because he kept getting moved up classes, which they did in those days. But they couldn't afford for him to stay on at school, so he left school at 14. But he was always in that tradition of working class intellectuals, and he liked reading about politics. I get a lot of my interest in reading from him. I mean, he was very strict, a patriarch, and it was not always easy as a father by any stretch of the imagination. But his love of reading and discussion as well. I mean, he would not brook any dissent beyond a certain level, but he did enjoy discussing intellectual ideas. So we did do that, even though he didn't tolerate a lot of dissent. He liked discussion, as long as he got the last one.
Of course. And what about your education? Where did you study? What did you study?
I studied history and English at Manchester University, and then I did a postgraduate course in 18th century. It's mainly 18th century literature, but the history of the book and various other modules. And I sort of fused that with history, because I like to do both. And I also once took a voluntary course, because where I worked at a university in those days, they would fund you to do a module. And I did one on feminist literary perspectives, and that was very good. Fantastic teacher, really good.
So you've used those elements, I'm reading, sort of reading, writing, research in what you do now. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do now? People might know you from Twitter as STILLTish, and they might know you because of your Gender Critical Woman blog.
Yeah.
So do you want to explain a little bit about what you do there?
Yeah, because many listeners might know or not know that I've got a son who identifies, inverted commas, as trans. He's not a woman, he's a gay boy. And I'd never affirmed or gone along with it. But when that came to my door, I wasn't alarmed at first, but then very soon I did realise what the implications were for women. So the very first things that I started to do was to go on a website called bailey.org, which is BAILLE.org. And that's like transcripts of judicial cases, and you can search them. It's not absolutely comprehensive, but it's pretty good. And I think the first task was I went through just searching transgender and started to look at the different legal cases. I think that was probably the first thing that I was doing.
That's a really interesting way to look for it, I think, isn't it?
I think I must have just seen one of the judgments, and then I decided to look. So there's quite a few. I've covered quite a lot on my blog, but I think it came with. I think it was when I first started. I think I came up with about 270 cases that had the word transgender in,
right?
And some of them were criminal cases. Some of them were like employment tribunals. Some of them had gone to the European Court of Human Rights. It was a really interesting, eye-opening way to approach it, because I had not known that all of this law had been passed, because there was deliberate stealth and lack of publicity about these cases. It's only now that we're getting to hear about, so much of this that had been going on. I mean, bearing in mind, I had one child in 2001 and one in 2003. And at that time, I had a full-time job and I was also doing a master's.
Wow. Yeah.
And I missed all of the Gender Recognition Act,
Yeah.
I missed all of that passing, which, a lot of, and then to be fair, I didn't think that we would go back as far as we have in terms of I didn't think we'd got everything, but I certainly didn't think that the gains that were made were being unpicked, at such a shocking rate, almost with no publicity.
But by we, do you mean women and girls?
Women and girls.
Yeah.
And by extension, the rights of homosexuals.
Yeah.
Obviously this impacts on gay men, but far more lesbians.
Yeah. So you started the Gender Critical Woman blog because of your son, really?
Yeah, it's really funny. I like to think that I would have been, that once however I had found out, even if it hadn't involved my son, I like to think I would have been clear-sighted enough to see that this was terrible for women and girls. But I did become aware of it via my son, who came home and, well, he told me he was gay, which was not a really surprise. But then when he came out as trans, and I'd heard of like Jan Morris and various sort of inverted commas transsexuals, never thought that would ever impact on my life. No. And of course, how wrong we were.
Yeah. So you looked at the legal cases. What was it about the legal cases that made you concerned?
Well, I think the one that really shocked me was, and I do cover this on my blog, I think it's called How Long Has This Been Going On? And it was basically a man in Leeds from where I'm from, who had, I think he'd been in prison for manslaughter because he'd killed his partner, who was a male. But that seemed to be something to do with perhaps the male not accepting him identifying as a woman. And then he was released, I think after, I want to say 15, 16 years maybe. He was released on licence, and he was released to a female bail hostel. And within 5 days, he'd committed an attempted sexual assault. And when I say attempted, it's because of the legal definition of rape means there has to be a penis inserted. And apparently, because he was on hormones, but it was nevertheless a brutal attack on a woman.
Wow. Yeah.
And then he was sent to a male prison. And this court case, which Jack Straw, Labour were then in power, he did not want the man to go into a female prison, happy days. But the European Court of Human Rights basically made it such that he could be moved to the female prison estate. And that was really shocking, because the actual crime itself was quite despicable. And obviously, he'd already been placing women in vulnerable situation because he was released to a female bail hostel. This was 2009, by the way, that this court case was going through.
Yeah.
So, and what struck me about it was that the professionals there are various professionals that turn up advising the courts on these type of cases, and they crop up a few different times. And one of them, I can't remember the name of the one that was involved in this, but he basically said that this man who calls himself Karen Jones needs to be with his female peers in order to have a social circle that helps him to learn how to be a woman. So it's basically just using women as support animals. And then somebody had mentioned, perhaps some of the women might not like it. And what will you do about that? And this same man, his name will come to me eventually, said something like, oh yes, there will always be that sort of woman who wants to cause trouble. That was the attitude to the women who were anticipated that they would object, and that's how they were dismissed.
I mean, it never fails to amaze, does it? However many times you hear it, it doesn't fail to amaze. For some of us, there's a light bulb moment. For some of us, it's a drip and a sudden, a sort of more general, slow, I think, realization. Which was it for you? Was there a moment when you couldn't unsee what you were seeing?
I think I couldn't. I think I sort of peaked pretty quickly, but I had the residual. I don't think I was ever, you can actually change sex, but I thought that there might be some vulnerable men who needed some sort of accommodation, just not in female spaces. And it took me longer to really embrace the fact that no, any man who identifies as a woman and wants to use women's spaces and women, that's, I'm not on board with that for anybody, even if I personally like them, because I don't think they can be a decent man if they in any way attempt to compromise women's spaces, even though they themselves might be actually quite nice. And there's loads of reasons why men end up in this. It's not all about porn addled, although that is a significant chunk of it. But there are people who become bodily disassociated either because of childhood trauma, sexual abuse, they've been in care.
Yeah.
And many of these men did start out as victims, but still not women's responsibility to house them.
Mm.
I mean, refuse from masculinity might exist, but that doesn't mean that women have to host the refugee camps, is how I think of it.
Yeah. So you're when you were thinking all of this, and when you're reading this stuff, you're also weighing that up against having a young man in your life, your son, who you love dearly, and you know is going through something really traumatic to him because he's dealing with all of this angst as well. How are you balancing those things up together? That's tricky, isn't it?
I don't think I always got it right, because sometimes when something particularly bad had happened, I might bring it up thinking that I would get through to him, that it's not your individual. I mean, I've said that to him. It's not your individual solution. It's causing harm on a massive scale, because I know he does actually care about women and girls' rights, but it's just become very distorted by this, I mean, so we eventually agreed not to discuss it anymore, but I said I won't, but I will reserve the right to send you information, either about the medical consequences or about things that are just so egregious that they ought to make you think. And so we just agreed that I would do it. And I did ask for an email address because I thought that would be ideal. Because I said, look, if I can email you, I know then I've done my duty. But you can file that and just ignore it. But I'll know I've done it. I need to know that I've done my job. Telling you, not just the things that are for him, the medical consequences, because he is medicalising, sadly. But also, it's my job to say, it's not just about you. This has implications, the knock-on implications for women and girls and children generally. And I'm not of that view that, obviously I've got quite I'm not old-fashioned, like my dad was very strict, patriarchal, but I'm not my son's friends. I mean, I'm their mum.
Yeah.
And that comes with responsibilities, and they're not always nice ones.
No. And I think the way you put that with, it's my duty to tell you these things, even if you're not going to read them. I think that would touch most kids, wouldn't it? They would know that they were being loved and looked after.
I do spend it. When something comes up, I think probably the recent one was about maybe 3 months ago. and I can't remember what it was specifically now, but I was telling him something, and I just said, I'm telling you this because I'm your mum, and it's my job to tell you. It's me. It's not these other people that love you that are not telling you. It's my job because I love you to tell you these things.
Yeah.
And he would never respond, but he didn't block me. And he would just come home and change the subject, which is fair enough. I felt like I'd done my bit, but then at least I wasn't importing sort of aggression and conflict into the house, because obviously I've got another son.
I when I first peaked and I read your stuff, I was quite struck by your name, actually, the Twitter name that you use, STILLTish, because it said something to me, and because I've got a similar background to you, and what it said to me was, you knew me before and I was this person. I'm still that person. You might.
Well, it was partly because I was under my own name, and I couldn't afford. I mean, it wasn't because I gave up work and had no income for about 5 years.
Yeah.
While I was, I just gave it up because this was a far more important fight to me. Plus, I'd been in a university, and I suspect that I probably would have never got a job there again because of my trade union activity and because of being a massive TERF. But it also was because, even though my son doesn't have the same name as me, because I didn't change my name and he's got a mix of his dad's and mine, I didn't want trans activists to, because that would have been, I felt that getting my son, that would have been like a scalp, to indoctrinate my son. And he's not shown any interest in being involved in LGBT groups or marches or anything, thank the Lord.
You get some horrendous stuff on
worried.
Twitter, don't you?
Oh, I really felt there was strong possibility that he could be predated upon by malicious actors if I was openly linked to him.
Yeah. So, can you tell us a bit about how you work? Because I can't even imagine how you. I mean, I'm always in awe at the amount that you do, about how you approach it. You've got a really sort of, to me, that going to the legal cases first, that was interesting, because most people would start with Google.
Yeah, well, the court cases are really good. And one of the reasons why I went down that route was because it's also unbelievable that by being able to link the court transcript in, there was a direct, I could prove that this actually happened, because it is also unbelievable. Yeah. So I think that was part, and then obviously because of primary research, my history background, that going to the source, that's key, for all of these things. And then looking at alternative sources and then sort of cross-referencing. So I suppose some of it will be from, it's been many years, well, not so much from my master's, but certainly from my undergrad, it's many years. And then you would look at, have they got a Twitter profile? Go on YouTube, have they done interviews? Loads of people have got like TED Talks and interviews. Then I look at, there's a blog written by a man who identifies as a woman called Zagria Blogspot, and that's a mine of information. And I can tell when there's a slant on something that's propaganda enough that I can still use that information, because a lot of people say out loud something that they don't realise is exposing themselves, if pardon the pun, so that's a good source. And podcasts, YouTubes that are run by trans activists, they're also a very good source. And then the bog standard going on LinkedIn, finding what people's employment is. And then often the late transitioning cross-dresser pipeline, they often tend to have companies that they've set up to advise. And they often have multiple companies that have all gone into voluntary liquidation or involuntary liquidation. One of them
all speaks of someone who wants to be something, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think because it's caught up in your identity, isn't it? There is nothing so powerful as a man with a fetish. It's all consuming. And so, of course, they don't want to do it part-time at a weekend. They want to do it full-time, and then they want to do TED Talks, and then they want to run guidance, and they want to make money. That's very, very common.
Wow. So you put together all this information, you post it for those of us, and I asked you beforehand, you just alluded to it, to give us an example of what you do.
That's right, and Tish is going to be telling us about a section of her blog called Creating the Trans Child. Tish, can I just start by asking, what do you mean by creating the trans child?
Well, I probably owe some credit to a YouTuber. I think she's called Kat Catania. She's Australian, and I'm not saying I wouldn't have come up with this myself, because it sort of seems obvious, but it was that put it into my mind, because she talks about new technology startups and all the methods they use to make their marketing go viral. And so basically what the marketing of bear in mind, 10 years ago, probably maybe 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, there was no such thing as a transgender child. And so we've had to invent it and implant it in people's consciousness. So I started looking at all the strategies. And so I think of it as product placement, and you've got them on CBBC, so Children's BBC, which I think was particularly egregious, because what are you doing when your kids are watching CBBC? You're in the kitchen making tea, you're assuming that the kids are okay because they've got BBC Children's TV, you're not worried about what they might be watching. And then you find out that they had I Am Leo, which is about a girl who identifies as a boy because she likes football, sweet little kid. And they even talk about putting her on puberty blockers. And they invite Polly Carmichael from the Tavistock, who says puberty blockers just pause puberty, which we know is not true. And this is the woman who's head of the Tavistock, which, for anybody new to this topic, is Tavistock is where the gender identity clinic was in the UK. So that was the first one that I noticed.
I mean, it is really interesting, like what you say, this concept of transgender children, it didn't exist 10 years ago. And I think sometimes we need to take a moment and recognize that, because really transition originally, in its original form, was a treatment and a last ditch treatment for people who couldn't overcome gender dysphoria. So we've sort of pre-decided the treatment for gender dysphoria and then applied it and turned it into an identity and put it onto children as well. So you've got a child who you don't know why they're gender non-conforming, and you don't even know if they've got gender dysphoria, but you're already deciding that they're trans.
My theory, which is shared by a lot of people, is that because adults, often male adults, have got into the transition stuff through sissy porn, it's men with a fetish. So what you really need is the innocence of childhood. That's a lot better option to sell it to people. These are vulnerable children. Nobody likes to hear about vulnerable children. Unfortunately, they are vulnerable, but for different reasons. But because we've captured social work, foster care, and all of these different agencies are bought into the idea of the transgender child, the very people who should be safeguarding them are in fact the biggest risk to them.
Who are the key players in this, and who's behind the scenes sort of creating this situation and this campaign?
Well, I did a series on the man who introduced the child part of the GIDS, Gender Identity Service at the Tavistock. Domenico, I'll probably pronounce it terribly, but Domenico C. Eglio. And I've done a series on him. And funnily enough, when he opened the children's, I did a series on him because he'd done a long talk. And somebody had said to him that they were worried that if you build it, they will come, which is from marketing speak, So And he joked about that. He thought that was funny. And I thought that was horrifying, because I think that's exactly what's happened. We've built it, we've marketed it, we've sold it, we've pushed it. And sure enough, we've got a 5,000% increase within less than a decade of kids going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, statistics from before this sort of concept of transgender really took off, a lot of them do sort of show um, that a lot of the time gender non-conforming or gender questioning young people would eventually realize that they're gay, or that they were processing a
Yeah.
trauma, or any other reason that they were just gender non-conforming, for example.
There's been loads of research. I forget what he's called. Richard Green, I think he's called Sissy Boys. And he did a long follow-up of young boys that had this, before it was being sold and marketed them to everywhere. And the overwhelming majority of them were just gay at the end of it. Which is why I'm particularly, because those of us do have kids that are proto-gay, there's often very early signs, because for whatever reason, gender non-conformity comes alongside with proto-gay boys and proto-lesbians. And because there's that early sign, I think they've sort of hijacked it to say that's an early sign of a biologically child. Because it's undeniable when you get a boy, doesn't mean that all boys that have these different atypical interests and, are flamboyant and have, not all of them will be gay. Some of them might just be a straight boy who's sensitive and perhaps very theatrical. So I tried not to foreclose that as an option, because my son did show interest in the stage, and we did take him to like a stage school for a little while. So, but what we're doing with the trans thing is we are foreclosing those options by slapping a label on them at a very early age. So I never labelled my son gay. I gave him time, but I suspected that that may be what I was dealing with. So I just made little accommodations. I didn't presuppose that I'd talk in his future about a girlfriend. I'd say a girlfriend or a boyfriend. And I did that to both my sons. So they knew if that became a reality, it was not a big deal.
I think that's a really interesting point that you sort of say about not foreclosing and sort of allowing your son the time and space to sort of figure himself out. And I do wonder, what your thoughts are on that element where the trans child is almost marketed as much to parents, or even more to parents than it is to children in many ways.
Oh, there's definitely, it's definitely become a fashion accessory. There are a number of celebrity women who got trans kids. There's Sade, who I always loved. Cher disowned a lesbian daughter, but she has a trans-identifying son who calls himself a girl. And Jamie Lee Curtis. I mean, that's just off the top of my head. There's definitely an over-representation in theatrical circles and the arts, and it's the new badge of showing that you're progressive and liberal and virtue signal, really. And then there are those women who, well, I cover, because obviously you can't really cover the children without covering the families. And in the ones that I've covered, it's mainly the mothers that are pushing it. I know that's not always the case, but it is mainly the mothers. And so I think we call it, those of us parents, in this trans housing by proxy. It has very similarities with that.
Yeah, I have heard similar comparisons myself. I mean, could you tell us a little about that? Are these mums doing this for attention for themselves then, or what are you suggesting by trans housing by proxy?
Well, I suppose the obvious comparison to draw with Munchausen by proxy, while you make your child ill, and that garners you a lot of attention. So I think that's something that's going on there. But one of the ones that I've done is on Kai Shepley. Now, his mum was an evangelical Christian, and her motivation was she was not going to have a gay son. But she had this little effeminate little boy who already, when he was 2 or 3, was wanting to play with the girls' things, like in the pink and shiny things, which I'm sure is something that babies do like. They like colours and shiny things, but we don't make boys' toys are pretty, do we? And children latch on to colour. So there's a lot of complications, but she literally says in articles that she was beating him to make sure he was not gay. And what has she got now? A trans girl. And she's feted by LGBT activists. So she's getting a lot of attention. And maybe she got negative attention for her Christian faith. And this is a great thing because she can garner this attention, this publicity, and perhaps get rid of the negative attention she was having for being an old-fashioned evangelical Christian. I mean, that's one mate. And also, because she was Christian, she definitely did not want to have a gay child, a child that may become a gay adult.
Gosh, yeah. So where does the money trail lead? Because a campaign or marketing or introduction of a brand new idea on this scale that's been as successful as it has, it requires funding. Where is that coming from?
Well, the main person to follow for funding is BJ Portraits. But because I had followed her, and in fact we discussed working sort of internationally to look at how this was manifested in different countries and pull out all the commonalities. Now, I think when I first encountered this idea, I thought it won't be the same in the UK because we've got the NHS. I thought I could see it happening in America, but I didn't really think it would be happening here. But then I started to follow some of the foundations that were funding the things that BJ Portraits on Twitter, and she runs the 11th Hour blog. And sure enough, I found that the Arcus Foundation is funding a huge amount of stuff in the UK. And it's also funding foundations that are based in the UK. So when if I'm looking at a charity, I look at who donates to them, and the same foundations crop up again and again. So Arcus Foundation gave Stonewall 150,000 US dollars to add the T to their activism. So they changed a gay rights charity and made it. And it's now not a gay rights charity. It's dominated by the transgender thing. And that's funded by a man who's heir to a medical technology or medical equipment company. And he's started making a foray into gender identity. And then there's BlackRock. Alan Neil, I think he's called Canford Heather on Twitter. He followed the money for BlackRock and found it was linked to a gender clinic. I mean, it's just the tentacles are everywhere. I mean, I got someone to download me and I made a spreadsheet of all the funding for Arcus foundations, and they were funding South America, they were funding in Africa, they were funding a Muslim girls charity in Birmingham, and they were funding evangelical Christians to try and get them to be more inclusive. So I find that really funny when they say that we're taking money from evangelical Christians, because actually there's a huge amount of money coming from Arcus Foundation. I mean, I cannot overestimate the extent of the money. So I've done a series on Barings Bank. So do you remember Barings Bank and it collapsed? The man called Nick Leeson speculated on the stock market and he collapsed the bank. They've still got a foundation in existence, and they've also funded Stonewall and Kaleidoscope Trust, another trans organisation. The extent of it is just breathtaking.
It really is. So I mean, how does this sort of come back into our daily lives? Where does this lead for children? We're sort of now in a situation where the evidence is beginning to suggest that, puberty blockers are not the best treatment. People are sort of still desperately trying to say that the cast review was biased or that she was transphobic for finding what she found.
Because imagine
when does it get given up? Where does it lead?
Well, imagine if you thought that you were doing the right thing and that all these other people were bigots. And now you find out that you've possibly sterilised, or definitely sterilised or encouraged sterilising children who are going to have impaired sexual function. They're going to be sterile. If they're boys, they're going to have a stunted penis. That's going to make the surgeries more complicated. The study that persuaded the Tavistock to introduce puberty blockers, a boy died of necrotizing fasciitis at the age of 18 because he didn't have a big enough penis for the normal penile inversion surgery, and they had to use another method, which I think they use the colon, but it's more complicated. It's not tested, and therefore he ended up dying. And yet, even though I think there was only like 66 or 70 children in that study, and that's a big issue to have a boy dying as a consequence. And a similar thing happened with Jazz Jennings, who's the American little boy who he went on puberty blockers when he was very young, and then he had the vaginoplasty, the penile inversion surgery. But of course, he couldn't have just the penile inversion surgery. He needed parts of other, and he had to have, I think, 2 or 3 revisions. I mean, I don't know if you've done something so horrific, it must be really hard to step back from it, especially if you're going to be legally liable, or it's your kid you've done it to.
Yeah, that's going to be a hard thing to admit for a parent, to realise that they've done that level of harm to their child. I was going to ask a question, for people who are listening and want to learn more. Where can they read up on this? Where can they learn more about this?
Well, the Gender Critical Woman blog. I think I've got nearly 350 or 390, I don't know, somewhere along that. And it covers a lot of things. It definitely covers the money. When I see a charity pushing this, I go and look at their accounts, I look at their social media, I look at who works for them. So I've done posts on why Girl Guides are pushing this, why the Samaritans are pushing this. And you see a lot of the foundations cropping up. So I know it can sound really tinfoil hat and conspiracy theory, but I think what you've got to realise is that this has captured it's captured the academia, and it's captured people as the new civil rights movement. So the charity sector, people just move from place to place. And so you find the same people moving to different charities and affecting them. So that's why I cover a lot of, so there's a lot of individual posts that are linked. And then I always look at the money, and you'll see the same. Jay Roundtree's charity crops up a lot, something called Esme Fairbairn. And then the big one is Paul Hamlin Foundation, who share a trustee with a trustee of the Scott Trust, which oversees the Guardian. So I've done a few on the Guardian because I thought that's interesting. Why is the Guardian so woeful on women's rights? And I started looking, and I found that not only they've got the shared trustee with the Paul Hamlin Foundation, who give money to gendered intelligence and mermaids, they sit on this board that has got editorial control, and I think hiring and firing power over the editor. So that opened my eyes. I thought, well, that's, so I've just kind of followed whatever. I just tugged on the thread, and where I just went wherever it led me, really.
Followed the threads. I mean, what's really struck me while you've been talking is there's so much funding and so much focus on this area from trans activists, and yet so little push for research into treatment outcomes or into the effectiveness or the ethics of their suggested solutions, affirmations, puberty blockers.
Once you've got them on cross-sex hormones, they're on for life. And then if you look at the surgeries, Germany's quite a big player in the surgeries. So I've also got a Substack. So I do slightly different things between the two. I'll speak probably more personally on the Substack. But I do cover things about the money to be made by that. So you're making people patients for life. And don't forget, if you've removed someone's testicles and ovaries, even if they detransition and they no longer want to be part of this identity, they're still going to be a medical patient for life. So it's a win-win for the medical pharmaceutical industry.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think the element of it that sort of interests me is, you know, the people who are supposedly spokespersons for the trans movement um, don't want to look into the negative side effects, don't want publicity, don't want to know more about the cast review, don't feel that it warrants further discussion or research.
Well,
And you would think if they had the best interests, you know,
they
if I
don't.
was part of a movement that had women's rights at its heart and something came out that was sort of talking about negative or harmful elements or treatments that women may undergo, I can't think of anything that would make me think, oh, well, let's cover that up then. So,
Yeah, but unfortunately, some people do, and it may be that people who are very successful. I noticed that in my employment, there's a certain level where if you want to maintain a critical stance, eventually the only people that are getting promoted are the ones who are toeing the line, and then you've got a whole layer of people that are just yes people, and they'll just do what's so then one person can get an incredible amount of control over an organization. And then you look at if you look at this the sector, you know, it's all over the charity sector, and the charitable commission seems really nervous about doing anything about this. And it's probably that might be entirely because it's not their remit, but the charity sector is definitely broken. You know, every time I think about, I don't donate to any of the charities that I used to, because NSPCC, I've done a 10-part series on them. The NSPCC is the only charity it's the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, but it has actually got statutory powers. And I think they can certainly report something to get external agencies to intervene in a child at risk. But they run Childline. Childline is where my son was indoctrinated. And I know this because I recognise some of the people that he used to show me that he was following. And I went through and I did a 10-part series on them. Now, the NSPCC, I think the new head of the NSPCC has come from another captured organisation. They just move around. The girl CEO of Samaritans came from Girl Guides. They're just so because there's like a groupthink in the sector, because we have such social sanctions for not agreeing with a dominant ideology, that we've effectively promoted the same people spouting the same things that move from charity to charity. That's the fundamental part of the story.
yeah, well, it's a little bit nepotistic as well, isn't it? It's, you know, it's a lot of this, it doesn't seem like it's a very grassroots movement. It almost seems that it's top down rather than,
Oh,
you know,
absolutely. It's elite driven. And then, of course, there's the phenomenon of you just need one trans identified person in an organisation, or a so-called trans child. Children's Commissioner of England, where is she? She's nowhere, because her head of comms has got a daughter that he calls his son. So that's in that organisation. So that becomes increasingly difficult then. And I think Helen Joyce has talked about this, that, you know, you hear all the time about, oh, they won't cover it because so-and-so's got a trans. And that's in the media. I mean, it couldn't happen before the internet, but it's the tentacles are just everywhere. And there's not just one cause, but there's a multiple.
Yeah, definitely. How can this resolve itself? You know, when you sort of look to the future, do you see a way for us to sort of solve this, move towards a resolution, or how do you see it all falling down?
I think it's a lot difficult now. We've got Labour in, and I say that as someone who was an active member of Labour, and I'm not anymore. Unfortunately, I think the sad thing is it will only be when there are legal cases and there's so many more children harmed. But we're starting to see some signs in America now. I follow a few journalists in America who are covering this, and there's a woman called Jo Olson Kennedy, and I've covered her quite a few times. Now, it's turned out that she took, I think, 2 million to run research on the kids that she was giving puberty blockers to, but she never actually published the outcomes. And she said she didn't publish the outcomes because she didn't want it to be used by gender critical people to threaten what she was doing. And you'll find that there's I think J.K. Rowling's definitely tweeted on that. She said something like, we can't let people know about the harm we're doing to the children, or people might stop us doing the harms to the children, a bit, sarcastically. So there's a little bit more, and obviously America's more litigious than here. So there's definitely, I mean, obviously I'll sort of see it more because I'm following it all the time. But I am hopeful there are some good signs coming up. But I think it's going to be, and then even if we get the legal things, pulling it out of all our institutions is going to be like Japanese knotweed. And again, people don't like to admit they've got something wrong, do they? I mean, I've had to face it. I've had to face that I've been wrong quite clearly, because the people that I thought would never do harm and that I'd supported, turns out that they are the ones doing harm. So I've had to sort of relearn a sort of critical thinking. Just because you agree with something on one thing and that they genuinely seem like a good person, you can't afford to just assume that they'll be right in all areas, because we all have blind spots. And the only way we'll change is to accept, maybe we just have a bit of humility.
I think that's a common experience that maybe a lot of gender critical women can relate to. I think a lot of us have had a moment where we've realised, and it can be a very hard realisation.
And to be on a journey as well, because I'm sure, I can't remember whether I used pronouns, but I think I only felt comfortable saying I wouldn't, because how could I use pronouns when I wasn't using them for myself? So I'm not saying I was like a, right on, hard line, ultra and clear cut. I had a sort of psychological, I could overcome that psychological barrier, because I could justify it. So I wouldn't do it for my son, so I can't do it for you. But I don't think that now, I think the pronoun thing was a lot more important than any of us thought it was. But equally, when I see people using the pronouns she, sometimes I think people need to go through that phase. And if you push back at all, it's going to make them more nervous coming into the fray, because they're trying to get involved. And then they're saying the wrong thing and we're jumping on them.
Yeah, absolutely. Let people sort of do their research and figure this all out at their own pace.
I mean, it's been amazing listening to what you've told us tonight. That's really staggering, the amount of work. We want to finish on a positive note, and we wondered who's your woman of the moment, your woman of the week, or your woman of the moment. Give us some other inspirational woman to look at.
Well, I think she might kill me for this, because I don't think she wants to go back on Twitter. But there's an account called Georgia Cross, really, really good at safeguarding advice, and I follow Georgia Cross, and I'll look up safeguarding and because lots of stuff about safeguarding, I think I probably wasn't safe to be guarding because you know what I mean? I was not, I didn't get it. I was a bit naive.
Yeah.
And so I really find all the women who write about safeguarding. And then just on a personal level, Ancient Dyke on Twitter, who is Leslie Simmons, and she's someone I consider a friend. But what's so lovely, Leslie hides a light under a bushel. She's doing so much. She's done so many things but she doesn't boast about them. But she's very well. She's done a lot of things in this field over the years, and even now she does. And she does other things with a girls' charity and she does food bank stuff. But what's really great about Leslie, I mean, apart from the fact that I just love the bones of her, is that Leslie never makes you feel like you're not good enough. She makes you feel completely welcome. And I think she's a fantastic advert for women who include and empower and support other women.
What lovely, lovely things you've said about those two women. That's lovely. Well, I've got to say thank you so much for doing this for us. This was our first ever venture into podcasting. And I think we've been so lucky to have you and your huge brain.
Yeah, no, thank you.
But also thank you for all the women and girls that you're doing this for, and for all the
And the gay
for
boys and
and
young
for all the gay
lesbians.
boys like your own son.
Thank you so much, Tish. That's been really fascinating. For listeners who want to know more, we will link Tish's blog and social medias in the description. We'll also put the names of her two women of the moment so that you can look into them. If you've enjoyed today's episode, our first ever, thank you very much. And you can follow us on our Twitter at InsightfulPod, where there will be updates about upcoming projects and new releases.